You all ready?
Yep.
Is everybody ready?
Yep, still here.
My sandwich is almost done.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Chicago Community Trust Impact Chicago webinar. Today's topic, gun violence in Chicago. Our two guests today are Professors Robert Sampson of Harvard University and Wesley Skogan of Northwestern University. Each has made a study of crime in Chicago. Our concerns are that community safety is one of the key pillars of any successful community. Kids have to feel safe getting to and from school. Shoppers have to feel safe for the commercial areas to thrive. Workers have to feel safe in neighborhoods surrounding their employers. Chicago will not truly succeed as a tourist attraction without it. Over the longer time frame, Chicago has become a much safer place than it was, but the job is far from done. Crime rates remain higher than we'd like them to be, and the homicide rate has increased significantly during the last year. The Chicago Community Trust has a strong commitment on this issue, supporting the education and economic development that will make a difference in the long term, as well as the anti-violence and justice reform strategies needed more immediately. I'd now like to introduce Jim Lewis, the Trust Senior Program Officer who oversees grant making in the field, to begin today's program.
Thanks, Terry. Well, let me begin by talking a little about how we're going to proceed today. I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the crime and violence trends that we've had in Chicago so that we have a good grounding for today's conversation. And then when I've concluded that, I'm going to turn it over to our two guests who have very, very distinguished records. We're very, very pleased to have them with us today. Robert Sampson, who's done path-breaking work on the nature of communities and how they operate, and crime, and Wes Skogen, who's just been an institution here in Chicago in particular, analyzing a lot of what's been happening on the ground and how policing operates, not just here in Chicago, but in the nation as well. They'll each talk a little about their work, and then I'll have a few questions for them for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, and you'll have a chance to interact with these two very, very important people in the field and ask them any questions or offer comments to them as you would like. Well, let me begin with a little history. There was a time in Chicago when it was remarkably safe, and if you were lucky enough to be 143 years old, you would have a shot at remembering it, because that year was 1870, and we didn't have any homicides in 1870. This is a line graph that follows the trend over history, and as you can see, we've come a long way. The late 19th century was, by our standards today, certainly a pretty safe Chicago. But Chicago became a lot more complicated, a lot more complex pretty quickly, and homicide rates went up. So we see a decrease following World War I, but then the Roaring '20s came on us, and indeed they were. The Capone era was not only myth, it was also fact. The Depression seems to, and then the coming on of the Second World War coincided with lower rates. But then starting in the 1950s, we had the climb that brought us up to the very high rates that have concerned us in recent years. You can see the spikes there in the early 70s, and then, of course, the much higher spike in the mid-1990s. But it's also important to note that from that 1990s spike, we also see the Across most of the 2000s there, we've had numbers that were in the mid-400s. There have been two spikes, one of them in 2008, one of them in 2012. The 2012 one has been of tremendous concern to us, of course. It's interesting to wonder if the same things happened in 08 as happened in 12. That's something we'll talk about a little as we go forward. Next, I want to unpack what's behind some of these rates. Look at what actually makes up the homicide totals that we have. This chart looks at the different motives that could be ascribed by the Chicago Police Department for homicides, where they were able to ascertain that. What's notable, obviously, is that the category for street gang altercations, the red line there at the top, has continued to be the most common motive for homicides, and it has come down, but it's fluctuated a lot on its trend down. It's also notable that the other three motives, gangland, narcotics, armed robbery, domestic altercation, each had around 100 homicides in the early 90s, but now have declined to under 50 for all of them. So homicides that are either associated with street gangs or in some instances with street gang members who may not have been actually in a gang activity continue to be the problem that's been the most intractable for us here in Chicago. It's important to notice in thinking about this a couple things. One, that homicides are actually a subset of all the shootings. If we were to look at the history of homicides here and elsewhere, we would find that actually, depending on place, greater proportions of shootings actually end up translating into homicides, and that's a whole science unto itself. The other thing that's striking in the map is that the homicides and shootings are not uniform across the entire city, but do tend to correspond to particular neighborhoods. And I know Professor Sampson is going to talk to that at some length in a few minutes. So I won't dwell on it other than to note that the homicide concentration has been largely on the west side of Chicago and then across much of the south sides as well. In Chicago, race and neighborhood coincide to a very high degree, and so community differences tend to map onto racial differences as we study demography. We can note from these lines that white and Hispanic homicides levels have always been relatively low, and while they've declined somewhat in the larger scheme of things, are not tremendously different. The greatest gains that we need to have yet tend to be in the African American communities. It sounds a little funny, perhaps, a little odd to have a slide here that talks about indoors versus outdoors. But that's another way of saying that the majority of homicides that take place now take place in alleys, on street corners, on sidewalks. They're the drive-by shootings that are so often in the news. And it's really a very small number of them now that actually happen inside people's homes or inside places. This points again to the importance of getting at the problem of that gang members and gangs have to do with our homicide rate here in Chicago. I don't have slides on it, but the pattern also would show that most homicides are committed by people who are between about the ages of 17 and 30, and that's true here in Chicago. It would also be true around the nation. It's also true that most homicides, not most, but the homicides are more likely to happen during the summer months, and certainly that was something that was discussed a year ago when we had our difficult year about whether the seasons and the temperatures had anything to do with it. And homicides are also heavier on weekends and times when people are out more. So it all translates to more of the killings happening outdoors rather than indoors in a variety of different ways. Not surprisingly, given that pattern, we find that the number of people who are killed in stabbings has declined hugely from about 150 back there in 1991, that pink line at the bottom, to under 50 today. So a 66% decline in that. Again, the number of people who are shot remains the really difficult problem. And I think just looking at this line, we'll talk about it more, and we'll be interested in certainly people's calling questions. But it just seems obvious that there's a connection between the use of guns and the homicide rate that exists. So who is holding these guns? This chart clearly shows that we've eliminated most of the fatal violence from persons who are not repeat offenders. Today, almost everyone who kills someone else has a prior record. That's a significant change from the way things used to be. If you look at that lower pink line, back in the early 1990s, over 300 murder offenders were people who actually did not have a prior record. That figure is actually down to 0. So the use of a gun seems to be a choice today that follows, it sounds funny to say, but a career in crime. Even for young people, these are often people who have already had contact with the criminal justice system and have an arrest record. So for many, it is a life, a set of relationships, a culture, or a society that they are part of that are the people who are most likely to be homicide offenders today. Superintendent McCarthy talks a lot about it, the difficulty of getting successful prosecutions, the importance of engaging the community and neighbors and witnesses in successful prosecution. The word clearance is the formal term the police departments use to say that a murder is solved. And the disturbing trend in this side is the lower number of homicides that are actually cleared or cleared in the same year, and that has been declining rapidly. For the last year, I believe it was only around 25% of homicides had been cleared at year's end. Obviously, the aspects of our criminal justice system that focus on deterrence work a lot less well if there is not an arrest and if there's not a successful prosecution. So it's definitely a concern, I think, for the police and for our community that we don't have a higher clearance rate. I want to conclude my part by talking a little about that incarceration system. As many of you listening may know, Illinois is a high incarceration state, and our nation is a high incarceration nation. This line chart here shows the number of felons that were under correctional supervision in different years. In 1985, that figure was a little over 50,000. By the late 2000s, that figure had climbed to over 120,000. Serious problem in many, many communities. That figure is very largely African-American community, in particular men within it. That has made it very, very difficult for African-American men to find jobs, employment. So many people look at criminal record when they're hiring. So it's a very serious consideration that this has become a major strategy for crime fighting. This last slide shows the impact of that incarceration on prison population itself, which has grown significantly from the mid-'80s when it was about 17,000. Now it hovers just under 50,000. This causes issues around overcrowding. It's obviously tremendously expensive. It's largely a product of longer and longer sentences, the truth in sentencing policies that have been put in place. Jail entries have actually tailed down a little bit in recent years as the crime rate has gone down, but because of longer sentences, the actual population in prison has increased. So that's the basic overview, context setting that we wanted to do for today. And it's time to get our very, very distinguished presenters in. So I want to turn first to Prof. Sampson from Harvard University. He's been the author of quite a lot of work in this area. His most recent book is Great American City, Chicago, and the Enduring Neighborhood Effects. And I would recommend to anyone who really, really wants to understand what goes on in neighborhoods and how they operate in evolving cities. So Professor Sampson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very well.
Great. Well, first let me say I'm glad to join this important conversation with you and Professor Skogan and hopefully some call-in speakers. I thought it would be useful to provide a brief overview of some facts that are useful to consider in discussing crime and violence and also gun violence. I've spent about 15 years intensely studying the city of Chicago, and as you just noted, recently published a book on the results. What I would like to point out is that Chicago is defined by a wide diversity of distinct neighborhoods. Probably most of the listeners appreciate that, but perhaps what is less well appreciated is that these differences have persistent effects on a surprisingly wide variety of outcomes. Some of the things that I've studied include crime, but go beyond that to look at things such as child health, civic engagement, home foreclosures, social disorder, or even test scores among kids, to name a few subjects that I investigate. So really, I think one might think about it as the way that a neighborhood logic influences many aspects of our lives. So really, the research attempts to unpack the power of place to influence our lives in multiple ways, and actually over long periods of time, hence the idea of the enduring neighborhood effect. So there's really three key facts that we should bear in mind, and I'd like to go over them. One is the neighborhood concentration, and Jim, you've already showed that a bit. I'll elaborate a little bit on it. Secondly, the notion that it's not just violence, that there are other social phenomena that are distinctly clustered as well. And third, the notion of persistence despite change. That is to say, big differences across neighborhoods tend to be quite sticky or durable over time. In fact, there was a famous book written back in 1929 called The Gold Coast in the Slum about Chicago. The contrasts and wide diversity still exist to a large degree. Indeed, the Gold Coast is still as golden than ever. So let's turn to the first slide that you've put up. And this portrays the concentration of violence and what I'm calling child well-being or child health. And this is an indicator of infant mortality and low birth weight, scaled just into low, medium, and high. And the stars are the murder rate, and they're proportional to the actual rate per 100,000. So the larger the star, the greater the homicide rate. And what one can see is that homicide rates are quite concentrated, particularly in areas of the South Side and areas of the West Side. So you see communities such as Englewood and Washington Park, communities on the far West Side, Garfield, North Lawndale, and so forth. And these all have low child health. Now, you might think this is just a poverty phenomenon. It's actually not. If you control for poverty, there's still a link between violence and child health. And we know that exposure to violence is a distinct risk factor in terms of later development. So I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. And I could show you many other slides, but I won't, that tell us that things go together, that we have to understand violence in relation to these other social phenomena. And I think it really points out, once again, the power of place to organize various social aspects of contemporary life. Go to the second slide. This portrays what I'm calling the enduring grip of disadvantage, or the persistence of poverty over a 40-year period. This is a significant time in American history and Chicago history. We saw outmigration from the central city. We saw increase in crime in the 60s and 70s. We saw economic boom, later followed by economic collapse, crime decline, lots of political change. But still, the pecking order of neighborhoods is remarkably persistent. The poorest neighborhoods tend to remain poor. The most well-off tend to remain well-off. There is change, as you can see. Neighborhoods such as the near South Side, near North Side have undergone some reductions in poverty, and that's important too, and there's reasons for that. But I'd like to focus on this larger picture of stability. Go to the third slide. The stability even extends into the most recent era of the Great Recession. This shows an index of concentrated disadvantage, which is primarily the concentration of poverty, unemployment, public assistance in 2000, and an indicator, the most recent indicator we can get beyond the census from 2009 on housing vouchers and people that are receiving public assistance. And it's also showing the foreclosure rate in 2009, and that's in thirds, low, medium, and high. The dark circles are high foreclosure rates. And what you can see is that the most vulnerable neighborhoods in 2000 with regard to concentration of disadvantage are, first of all, still much more likely to be disadvantaged in terms of housing and poverty in 2009, but also the Great Recession unfolded primarily in those neighborhoods. So the vulnerable got hit even harder, and on the other end, the well-to-do were largely protected. If we could go to the fourth slide. Now moving back to violence, this is a bit of a paradox, but I think it's important to get on the table, and that is that even though we've seen a considerable decline in violence, as you've noted, that sort of dashed line that's superimposed on this chart, the relative crime rates in neighborhoods are, again, relatively stable. I'm showing here the robbery rates and the homicide rates in Chicago. Robbery rates tend to be higher overall. Homicide is more rare. Homicide is in the dark circles. And you can see that, for example, in the upper right-hand corner, the robbery rates are, again, remarkably persistent over time. High robbery rate communities tend to remain so. Similarly, bottom left corner, you can see that homicide rates are also very persistent. But what's also going on here is that in all these communities, violence is declining. So we have a simultaneous phenomenon going on here of neighborhood persistence and then the notion of secular change, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. If we go to the fourth slide, we should also think about the factors that go beyond just violence and the concentration of poverty. There's a long history in criminological research of trying to understand the mechanisms that lead from concentration of poverty and other factors to outcomes such as crime and violence. There's multiple theories. One that I explored in depth in the book using a variety of methods trying to tap into collective processes, including one that we've termed collective efficacy, which is defined as the combination of social cohesion and trust among residents, along with a shared expectation for social control that others in the neighborhood will take action if needed, if there's, for example, a crime in the neighborhood. We use community surveys to measure this, going beyond the census data. And to make a long story short, what the data seem to suggest is that areas that are disadvantaged, that are unstable, have lots of residential turnover, tend to have lower rates of collective efficacy. We also looked at the importance of acquaintanceship ties, network ties, in other words, among individuals, and the density of nonprofits and the interorganizational ties among community leaders, and found that those were also related to collective efficacy. And in turn, collective efficacy is related to not just violence, but to indicators of social disorder and indicators of health in the community, including mortality, but also things such as asthma and other general indicators of well-being. If we could go to the next slide, last slide, thought I would show just a little bit in more detail some of the patterns here. And this is taking into account, once again, the secular change in violence, which is a decline over time. And what I'm showing here, left, 1995, is the relationship between the homicide rate, scaled per 100,000, the way that criminologists typically measure it, and showing it for neighborhoods that have collective efficacy in the lowest quartile. In other words, these are neighborhoods that are overall low in collective efficacy compared to the highest quartile, controlling for the concentration of disadvantage, stability, population size. In other words, most of the usual suspects, and even controlling for prior homicide. And what we see is the rate in 1995 for high collective efficacy neighborhoods is about 10 per 100,000, and for those that are in the lowest quartile, it's so about 16. So about a 50% increase, which is quite substantial, controlling for basic demographics. If you go to the right-hand column, what you see is the exact same pattern, but yet overall lower homicide rates. Again, high collective efficacy neighborhoods compared to low, we see about a 50% differential. And so the decline is actually about the same magnitude. So what this tells us then is that we have simultaneously going on major changes in society. We can talk about this. It's not just Chicago, that are leading to reduced violence rates. But this overall picture of the importance of the spatial distribution of homicide and how that both changes and is persistent over time, I think is a crucial question to bear in mind. So hopefully these slides give the listener some sense of the patterns, and hopefully we can discuss them a little bit more. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's now bring Professor Skogen into the conversation. Professor Skogen, as I had mentioned, has been one of the foremost analysts of the role of policing for many, many years in his work at Northwestern University. Authored a number of books. I would refer you to his website, where there's an amazing wealth of information on both Chicago policing and his work nationally and internationally as well. So Professor Skogen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Why don't you go back to that earlier slide, the two book covers, please, for a few minutes. I'll make a few general comments. First of all, I'd like to thank the Trust as well to have a chance to participate in this conversation. The way we sort of divided the labor is between Rob Sampson, who's a sociologist, talking a bit about the patterns of crime and some of the sources of crime problems through neighborhoods. I'm in a political science department, so I'm more focused on policies, what it is we can do about it, what are the kinds of alternative strategies that have been adopted for dealing with violent crime. And we can think of these, for today's purposes anyway, in sort of two great categories. One would be the criminal justice response, or more specifically for today, the police response. But the other would be the community response, both neighborhoods and service providers and activists. And so in thinking about what I could sort of introduce the discussion to, I thought I would just talk very briefly about those two great approaches to violence prevention. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about community responses to crime, and then second of all, I'll talk a little bit about police responses to crime. So if we look first of all to community responses to crime, what I presented here is the model for one particular program. It's called Cure Violence. I picked it first of all because it's in Chicago, but second of all because it touches on, it seems to me, most of the great themes that you see in the violence prevention literature. And so by thinking about it this way, as it's displayed on the screen, and talking about it this way, we can sort of have a chance to quickly run through some of the community-based options that are out there in a variety of programs across the country. Lots of places have tried most of the boxes that you'll see on your screen right now. This is a program aimed at individual high-risk young men, both high risk of being an offender and high risk of being a victim. As Jim Lewis pointed out in his introductory remarks, many offenders have a record of arrests, but it's also true that in Chicago, many victims have a similar record of arrests, and that the relationship between victims and offenders is often quite a close one. So this particular program focuses on young men who are at high risk, and that's a high risk of being a victim or high risk of being an offender, because in their lives they actually face both of those risks at the same time. One thing that you see a lot of focus on around the country, for example, on this particular slide, would be client outreach. That would be something akin to traditional social service connection activities by community organizations. This certainly goes back to the 1950s, and YMCA, street workers, and the Chicago Area Project, where program staff members working directly with individual clients, young men in this particular case, helping to connect them with services, helping them to get a GED, because we're not talking about people who are any longer at school. So helping them to get a GED, helping them learn to fill out application forms, showing them getting enough computer skills that they can help put together a resume, and trying to help them adjust to problems that they're having with their families and other loved ones, and working on them one by one in a client-mentor kind of relationship. And programs across the country focus on this. Clergy involvement is often very important. In many poor neighborhoods, churches are among the strongest institutions that remain. They're central places in the community. People know them. People feel comfortable in them. They have congregations that come from the community. The ministers have stature in the community. And so church-based programs have the advantage of targeting many neighborhoods that really need it the most. Community mobilization strategies would involve marches and rallies, attempts to turn out people for crime prevention programs, attempts to turn out people to activities that will advertise the various alternatives that are available instead of violence. Educational campaigns, of course, are always important, pointing to both access to programs and also trying to reshape norms about communities by making it clear what kinds of expectations that we have about how people should be behaving. Street intervention is another Chicago favorite. This would be street workers who deal more directly with gangs, deal with their clients in a gang member relationship, and work to negotiate relationships between young men who are trying to leave gangs and try to negotiate disputes between gangs so that they don't end up in violence. And then finally, police and prosecution, which we'll be talking about in a minute. And that really has to do with raising the risks of becoming an offender. All these things, various mixtures of these things around the country tend to focus on three intermediate causal mechanisms here. One is the norms of the young men who are the targets of these programs. Another is their view of the risks and costs of getting involved in the violent life. And that's costs to them and to their families and their communities, and it's very much risks to them. And then finally, helping them understand the wider decision alternatives that they have, the things that they can do instead of being involved in violence, the things that they can do instead of trying to find an economic niche in the drug trade, things they can do instead of joining gangs, other kinds of more positive alternatives they have in their lives. And with the levers, the movers, the drivers, the program over on the left-hand side of that slide, changing the decision alternatives, the norms, and the sense of risks. The idea is that you can affect community violence. There's a long tradition of this. The Boys and Girls Clubs of America, for example, have a very impressive violence reduction / gang involvement program that they run in Boys and Girls Clubs around the country. And I'd recommend Boys and Girls Clubs as a place to look to if you're looking for a program in your neighborhood. There have been attempts to organize these kinds of projects here and there. The famous Chicago project would be the Little Village Project, which was done in the 1970s and 1980s by Irving Squirtle. And he was very much pursuing the kinds of strategies that we see here. So that on the community side, mobilizing community resources, education, involving community influentials like the clergy, identifying high-risk young men and working with them, developing relationships with gangs to try to negotiate settlements short of violence. All these things are sort of non-enforcement oriented approaches to community violence. And we have a long tradition of doing this in this country. There have been many dozens of evaluations of the effectiveness of these kinds of programs. We can now go to the second slide, which is the other sort of great category of responses to violence, which would be police strategies for dealing with crime. Now, I'm sure we'll get to a long discussion of these later when we include the audience and start having a dialogue about these. But I think for policing, we can divide them into three great categories. One would be smart gun policing, which is focusing very specifically on guns. As the introductory slides prepared by Jim Lewis, I think, pretty nicely showed, the homicide problem is a gun problem. So that things that focus very specifically on guns it's a big leverage point. It's a big leverage point for reducing homicide because by and large that is the homicide story. Then there are programs, policing programs aimed at gang policing, and we can talk about those as well, targeting particularly violent groups and targeting high-risk individuals. And then the third big category of policing strategies would be more community-oriented, and that would be what I call smart community-oriented policing, because you can't arrest your way out of a violence problem. The police have to basically provide the kind of safety and security that creates space for the community to reassert itself, and for the community to start effectively transmitting norms, and for the community to start influencing the lives and activities of young people there. That's exactly the kind of collective efficacy that Robert Sampson talked about a while ago. So in the smart community-oriented policing category, I'm stressing here the importance of being responsive to community concerns and priorities, because they vary a lot from place to place. We saw in some of Jim Lewis's slides about how different Chicago communities have vastly different violent crime problems, vastly different homicide problems. And the police need to be sensitive to these differences in priorities and differences in character problems across communities. Second of all, they can do a lot, I think, in terms of assisting in norm building, gaining the respect and confidence of the community, and giving respect to the community, and showing confidence in the community is going to be very much part of this initiative. And then finally, assisting in community mobilization, helping the community mobilize itself in response to crime problems, helping the community mobilize itself in order to effectively respond to crime. I'd like to focus a little bit in detail on the third category, the smart community-oriented policing, because I don't want it to get lost in today's discussion. Too often in discussions of what to do about crime, we almost immediately shift to police and corrections, to prosecution and prisons. And while they have an important place in the mix, smart community-oriented policing can be effective as well. So I've got just a couple more slides that show a little bit of that in Chicago. As some of our listeners will know, Chicago in the middle of the 1990s began a community policing program which was very much oriented at trying to rebuild public trust and confidence in the policing. At that time, it was perceived that police had largely lost their legitimacy in the streets of poor neighborhoods in Chicago, and they were providing not particularly good service, especially in poor neighborhoods. So building public respect for the police and building better police responsiveness to community problems was a big focus of Chicago's policing program. And what you see here in these slides are some illustrations of our attempts to track the effectiveness of this program over time. So, for example, police responsiveness to local problems, responding to the things that are of concern to the community. If you look on the upper left-hand side, you can see here some very, very clear trends over time among all three of the large community groups in Chicago, whites, blacks, and Latinos. And you can see how, over time, people's belief that the police were indeed being more responsive to the problems that concerned residents in the community went up pretty substantially. Among African Americans, they went from 28% to 45%, which is a very large increase. Among Latinos, it went from 33% to 50%. That's the little red line that you see in the upper left-hand side. And it went up among white Chicagoans as well. The increase wasn't as great, but as you can see very clearly, they were already pretty well satisfied with the quality of service that they were getting. The two of the other slides here look at a more general quality of service index, not just responsiveness, but how good a job that they do helping victims, how good a job that they do dealing with crime problems. And you can see that the quality of service index also improved very greatly over time. You can see that in the lower left-hand corner, where among all three of these large community groups, the perceived quality of service went up quite a bit. Among African Americans, from 25% to 40%. Thought they were doing a good job. Among Latinos, went from 30% to 48%. And for me, very strikingly, in the upper right-hand side, this was true of young people. Now, young people always have the most conflicted relationship with the police. They're always the ones who have the most difficulty getting along with the police for a whole variety of experiences that many of us will remember from when we were young. But by looking just at people under 30 in our surveys over time, what you see is that their kind of respect for the quality of service that the police were delivering went up very substantially over these time periods. Among African Americans, a rise of about 15 percentage points, for example. So even among the most difficult target in some ways of police reform, trying to involve the public, Chicago did pretty well over this time. If you give a good program, you can get these kinds of very substantial responses. And you can see on the lower left-hand side the combination of better policing and declining crime, which was a huge factor over this time period, made Chicagoans in all backgrounds feel an awful lot safer. And basically every group that we tracked over time felt less and less afraid of crime over time as it went down so substantially during the 1990s and the 2000s. I've just picked two groups here that sort of divide us by social class, among homeowners and renters. And you can see that renters are more fearful than homeowners. They're not as well off typically as homeowners, but that both groups grew significantly less fearful over time as the police were seen to become more effective and as neighborhood crime was dropping. And then finally, the last slide would be
We'll be back here in a second.
Okay, we're working on this.
There we go.
Very good. Brief technical difficulties. Assisting in community mobilization. One of the things that the Chicago police did as part of their community policing project was to try to help neighbors help themselves by providing safe venues for groups of neighbors to get together on a regular basis to talk about problems and to meet with the police and discuss what the responses could be. This little chart that you see here it's actually a lot. There's 44,000 meetings between the police and the public that went into creating this little chart. And I got little pieces of data on every one of those 44,000 meetings. And what you can see is that attendance in these neighborhood meetings was pretty strong over about a 15-year period. Its attendance is always best in September. Chicagoans will know September is maybe our only good month. The low point is always December or January, and you can see that as well. So attendance was very seasonal, but remained substantial and strong over time. And over the course of this period, almost 1 million people showed up at these meetings. It's 1 million people. It's a very, very high rate of participation. So that the regular meeting between the police and the public, their mobilization around neighborhood problem solving, our surveys showed that people who come to meetings got very involved in neighborhood projects of a whole variety of kinds, ranging from cleanup, fix-up, paint-up programs to positive loitering and other attempts to deal directly with crime problems. That these meetings really helped mobilize the community in very significant ways. And it was done so with the combined support of the police and neighborhood organizations to make this happen. So that's the extent of my introductory comments. But again, the importance of the two great approaches, the community-based approach and the police-based approach, and to find the proper strategies and the proper mix of strategies is the real policy challenge.
Thanks. Let's turn to some questions I have that will bring you both into a conversation. And the place I'd like to begin with is a theme that's run through, I think, both of your presentations and certainly did through mine. And that is returning to this slide that, in fact, crime rates have declined over the last 20 years. We've had some bad news this past year, but if you look at the long 20 years, it's not been bad news. When someone asks either of you to think about why we've had this long decline run and why it's also affected other large American cities as well, how do you approach it? What do you think are the major reasons?
Yeah, let me first of all say I've looked at charts like this, and let me try another way of describing to our watchers the significance of what they're seeing. If you took the number of homicides in Chicago in 1991, which is the peak here on the chart we're looking at, and if crime had not gone down, if it had just stayed as high as it was in 1991 over this period, there would have been 6,300 more dead people. That's a huge life savings, 6,300. so that the consequences for human life of the declines that we're seeing here are very, very significant. This is one of the big stories of the end of the 20th century, has been this large decline in crime. There would have been 6,300 fewer dead people, fewer murders, 435,000 fewer robberies, and we're just talking for Chicago. So this decline has been very, very significant. It's really changed the lives of people in a substantial way.
What do you think's been driving it?
Well, I would say that this is one of the great unanswered questions in criminology. If you think about the patterns, and actually you showed an earlier slide going way back into the roaring 20s, there's a tendency among many to think that crime tracks closely economic conditions, sort of a materialistic explanation. That doesn't really work. Crime was going up in the roaring 20s, going down during the Depression. In this most recent era of the Great Recession, the worst economic time since the Great Depression, crime has continued to decrease. So it's a bit of a mystery. There's probably 4, 5, 6 favorite explanations among incarceration, policing, age structure, again, the economy. Some have even argued abortion laws in the early 1970s have a role to play, changes in family structures. My own sense is that it's really not any one thing, and I particularly think we can't just pinpoint it to specific policies in any one city, as is often done, for example, in New York. As this chart shows, the decline cuts across many different cities. I would also note that we've seen crime declines in Canada and other Western industrialized countries as well. So there seems to be something rather fundamental going on, something that is not just unique to any one city. I think in American cities, we also need to look at the social transformation of cities. So, for example, we've seen great increases in immigration. The high concentration of poverty in the so-called inner city has tended to recede. Poverty is much less concentrated now. It tends to be more dispersed. There's also poverty in the suburbs. So the old model of just poverty in a small core set doesn't really seem to hold. And I think that there's some good evidence that this sort of social transformation and increases in immigration are partly an explanation of the decline. But overall, I think there is no one magic bullet.
Professor Skogen, your view?
Yeah, I've also pondered this problem, both in general, but I've also spent a substantial period trying to figure out for Chicago in particular what the combination of circumstances would be. I mean, crime is a very local phenomenon. If the famous politician Tip O'Neill had been a criminologist, he would have said that all crime is local. So I've tried to figure out what's been going on in Chicago. There's a possibility, for example, in the period between 1990 and 2000, of a pretty noticeable incarceration effect. As one of the charts showed, over that period, prison population in Illinois, and I've charted it more precisely for people who come from Chicago, grew very, very substantially. And we know that incarceration rates affect crime rates. A good rule of thumb would be about maybe 25% of the change in crime can be attributed to shifts in incarceration rates. It's an expensive approach to crime. It's a destructive approach to crime, but it's appropriate for some people, and it's effective for many people. And so between 1990 and 2000, when incarceration rates from Chicago were going up very, very noticeably, there's almost inevitably was a substantial incarceration effect. But as your slide also showed, starting in 2000, the Illinois prison population flatlined. And so for the last 13 years, it actually hasn't gone up. So the continued decrease in crime after 2000 can't be directly linked to shifts in incarceration, because incarceration rates stopped growing. Other things were going on, however. Into the 2000s, there also was a noticeable adoption by the Chicago Police Department of what I would call smarter policing. they started to catch on to a wave of innovation that was taking place in policing across the country. And that wave finally came ashore here in Chicago about 2000, 2002, as they began to pick up some of the smarter ideas that are floating around in the world of policing, and started to turn them into substantial programs here in this town. And then, of course, there was the community mobilization around crime, which in Chicago started, as you saw in my chart, in the second half of the 1990s, which was a time when crime was dropping very sharply. And that's particularly interesting because beat meeting attendance rates were always highest in African-American neighborhoods. That's where the participation in CAPS has been the most substantial. That's where the beat meetings had the highest turnout rates. That's where most of the people who came to beat meetings live. And so the community mobilization was most effective in the areas where the decline in crime was the greatest. It was true over that entire period. So I think for me, three of my most likely suspects are incarceration, community mobilization, and smarter policing. And they sort of come on stream at different times. Community mobilization comes on in the second half of the 90s. Incarceration starts in the first half of the 90s. Smarter policing starts in Chicago in the early 2000s. And so this confluence of events kind of piles up over time. And I think that Rob Sampson is correct. It's probably not one thing, but there are some likely suspects that we can point to.
I wanted to return to the trust issue. That seems very important to me, and it's certainly a theme that runs through your work around the CAPS, and I think is behind the efficacy work as well. The next slide shows two of the most important people, actually, in the history of police trust issues in Chicago. The one to the right is Commander Burge, who probably needs no further introduction beyond that. But on the left, the guy on the left is recognizable to many as Jesse Owens, but the guy who's hugging him was also on that track in 1936 in Berlin, and that's Ralph Metcalf, who went on to become the congressman from the South Side. And he entered the fray on the police trust issue when he was pulled over on Lakeshore Drive as congressman. And was justifiably outraged by it, and became very, very involved in the movement to recruit black police officers and to have better police community relations, particularly in the African American community. So I would ask again, how important is this trust issue? Superintendent McCarthy talks about it all the time with regard to the ability to solve cases. And are there things we can continue to do that the police department or somebody should be doing to improve it beyond where it is now?
Well, I think the evidence shows that the trust that residents have or don't have in the police is an important property of the community. Our research in Chicago has looked at this from a number of different angles. One way is to ask about satisfaction with the police, and as Professor Skogen showed, there are racial differences in that, but fortunately also increases over time in satisfaction. Another way we've gone about it is to look at what we've called legal cynicism, which is kind of a corrosive attitude that some individuals have about the law, legal institutions, sort of expectation of corruption, and where people expect others to get around the law if they can get away with it, the extent to which the police are unfair. And this is a troublesome concept, I think, in the sense that the data shows that, first of all, there's a high degree of variability across both individuals and communities in the extent to which people are cynical about the ability of law to maintain order, and even the cynicism about the motives of others. African Americans and Latino Americans tend to be more cynical than the whites. However, in our research we showed that in large part those differences are explained by the severe concentration of disadvantage that African Americans and Latinos are exposed to. So once you control for that, it tends to diminish. And the second finding is that in areas where you do have high levels of cynicism about law, we see both higher violence rates among individuals and the persistence of violence in particular communities. So there does seem to be independent evidence that suggests that either Superintendent McCarthy, in terms of his particular focus on trust, but also more general criminological theories, are on the right track to really taking this serious. And there's also a broad literature on the importance of legitimacy in terms of how people are treated even in a simple traffic stop. Evidence shows that if you are treated with respect, even if you get a ticket, you're likely to come away with a much more positive outlook than if treated poorly. So the evidence, I think, is coming together around the fact that establishing trust between the police and community, which I think is one of the crucial aspects of what Professor Skogen is calling smart community policing, is central. And I think the research that we've done, at least in terms of looking at attitudes and the correlation of cynicism with violence, tend to support that move.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we might think of as a law-abiding society is going to be a place where the legitimacy of the institutions of order and justice is respected, and where the institutions of order and justice respect the people. And when both of those things are operative, I think a law-abiding society is within reach. The police are a practical people, but they have lots of practical reasons to actually be quite concerned about the trust and confidence that the community that has in them. At the narrowest level, they can't maintain neighborhood safety without the public. You need the public for almost every aspect of an effective justice system. You need the public to contact the police in the first place when a crime occurs. You need the public to step forward as witnesses when they see something happen. You need the public to get involved and help you when you're looking for suspects, when you're looking for people who are known but flown, and you're out there trying to find them. You need the public to be willing to testify in court. You need the public to serve on juries, and when they serve on juries, you need a public that will believe that police officers are telling the truth when they describe what it was that happened during the course of their investigations. And when the kind of legal cynicism that Rob Sampson talks about starts to become rampant, the police lose all of that support, and that support is fundamental to them being able to do their own jobs. So that they need it and they know it. And so efforts by police departments to retain or rebuild the trust and confidence of the public are really important. But it even goes beyond that. We know, for example, that when people have trust and confidence in the police, they're more likely to follow police instructions. They're less likely to resist arrest. They're more likely to comply rather than fight back. We think that police officers are much safer when they encounter people on the street, when people on the street have some respect and confidence in them, so that it helps enhance officer safety in their day-to-day contacts with the public. Even members of the public whom they're approaching with suspicion and who they think may be up to no good, they'll be, we think, a lot safer if trust and confidence is more widespread. So that's a practical matter for police. This is also really important. It's important for preventing crime. It's important for maintaining their own safety.
There's two more questions I'm going to ask you before we go to the audience. The first of those is to talk a little about gangs. Superintendent McCarthy has talked about a lot about how intransigent the gang problem is and how much more difficult it's been here than in New York. The map I've got up there shows a proliferation of different gangs that identify with a different territory across the city. So there's an entire geography of gangland in Chicago, and I guess has been going back, certainly historically. How important is that for driving the crime rates? Do people commit crimes because they're in gangs? Do they just happen to be in gangs? Do gangs enable it? Is it something we should be particularly concerned about, or is crime prevention much more about the individual and the neighborhood? How should we think about that?
Well, I guess I would answer by saying both gangs and the crime phenomenon together are important. Sometimes it's difficult, almost like a chicken and egg problem. When gangs are used to explain crime, one can also step back and say, but why are there gangs in a community? And many times the gangs are defined in terms of their criminal activity. So in some explanations anyway, it's a little bit problematic analytically, because it's a little bit like saying crime is explaining crime. That said, the gang structures in Chicago, I think there's a general agreement, tend to be more tenacious than in some other cities, although they've been destabilized over time, according to some experts. There's a long history in criminology of looking at the importance of the gang. In fact, if you go back, way back into the early Chicago School of Criminology and Sociology, there's a famous book actually written by Frederick Thrasher called The Gang. And he was actually looking at what he called unsupervised peer groups and even young kids on the argument that anytime you had peer control systems, you were likely to have higher rates of delinquency. These were sort of much more mundane types of gangs in delinquency in an earlier era. But the same basic idea, I think, applies today in the sense that whenever there's a structure of control among gangs that the community and the police are unable to penetrate, then you do have a potentially higher crime rate. But again, there are real difficulties here, because oftentimes it's difficult even to define, let's say, what a gang crime is. Take the example of two gang members, that is, they're defined as being in a gang, are in a bar and have an altercation over a girlfriend or something. This happens all the time. And there's violence. Well, oftentimes that'll be labeled as a, quote, gang crime because they're in a gang, but the crime actually has nothing to do with being in the gang. So my read of the data is that we don't have a precise estimate of how much of crime is actually motivated by gangs. We do know, based on some excellent work in Chicago looking at networks among gang members, that there is a high degree of connection and in terms of revenge and retaliatory killings that are highly focused on gang members. So in the sphere of gang interactions, most of it is really not aimed at the public, but is very much within the gang structure. So I guess I would step back and say that we want to focus on gangs, but we also don't want to divorce that from the broader problem of violence and the prior question of the neighborhood and also individual differences in terms of why people are in gangs and why gangs exist, which is really the more important question.
Let me go to my last question before turning to the audience. 2012, that number is higher than it is for 2011 or 2010 or for 2009. It's gotten quite a lot of discussion, the 500-plus deaths we had last year. Statistical anomaly, or do you think something was driving it in particular that has required a particular response beyond our overall interest in continuing to drive these numbers down? How should we think about that?
Well, one year's not a trend. You can see it's just where it was 4 years before. Here's what's happened. When you look at a chart like this, what's happened is if we granted everything Rob Sampson just talked about the technical difficulties of classifying gang victims or offenders or incidents as being gang-related, but if you take the broad categories of gang-related and non-gang-related homicide, when you go back on this chart to 1991, what you had was a homicide rate that was principally driven by non-gang crimes. Almost all of it, in fact, in the early 90s, was domestics, people who knew each other, neighbors, fights in bars, and the gang component of it was fairly small. And then what's happened in Chicago is, over time, year after year after year, the homicide that's in this broad non-gang category has come down, down, down. And it's come down very smoothly. It has just declined in a beautiful straight little line over that time. So it's the non-gang homicide that has declined. The gang homicide is fluctuating. It goes up and it goes down. It goes up and it goes down. It's responding to different social forces than the non-gang. The non-gang is reflecting the broader decline in crime in society. The gang crime is reflecting organizational priorities and internal organizational fights and shifts in the drug trade and all kinds of things that are very specific to gangs. So now today, the total homicide rate is so driven by the gang component of it that when things go bad in the gang front, the citywide total goes up. But I guarantee you that when things go better in the gang front, the citywide total is going to go down. So it's really driven by the organizational dynamics of gangs in a way than it wasn't in the early 1990s, when gang homicide was a much smaller percentage of the total. So one of the things you're seeing in this more recent fluctuation just is the success of all the other kinds of homicide having so sharply receded. It's now almost gone, leaving us with a gang problem.
Yeah, I would just add to that and agree with Professor Skogan on the fact that 1 year does not a trend to make. I think it's been somewhat problematic. Chicago's gotten a lot of attention for last year's increase. I think part of the reason is that it's being subjected to comparison to New York, which is really tough because their decline has been continuous, and it's the largest city, so there's a tendency, I think, to compare it. Also, frankly, I think there's a political issue here. The fact that Obama's from Chicago, the recent particular shootings, for example, of Hedge Pendleton, and the political story around that, because of the fact that Obama lives in Chicago, I think the city is getting greater scrutiny. But I would look at the long-term trend and really say that it's hard to make predictions, but I would, if I had to make one, don't think that it's going to continue to go up. In fact, I think the last few months, February and into March, it's down again. So again, there's fluctuations, and we'll just have to wait and see and hope that the overall decline really holds over the long run.
Thanks. We are now at the point in our show where we are ready to bring the audience in. We already have questions flowing in. If all of you look at your screens, if you're listening through your computer, type your question into the Q&A pane. We'll read your questions and pose them to our panelists, Professors Skogen and Sampson. If you're listening by phone and wish to ask live, use the Raise Your Hand feature on your computer. The moderator will unmute your phone, and you'll be able to ask that question in person. So as you're doing that, as you're forming your questions, putting them in, we already have a couple that have been coming through as we've been talking, and I'll cue Kathy to read our guys our first question.
What impact do gun turn-in campaigns have? Are they effective?
There's been a fair amount of research on gun turn-ins, and it depends on the question you ask. If the question is, are you getting good guns, and is that reducing the shooting rate, the answer is no. But if you step back and ask why it is that communities do the gun buybacks, they're doing it for a much broader set of goals. They're doing it to raise the visibility of the issue. They're doing it to mobilize the communities around the campaign. They're doing it to involve the churches, because the churches are very often involved either as being the place where the guns are turned in, or places to market the upcoming turn-in of members of the community. So I think as a community mobilization strategy, as a norm-building strategy, there's a lot of merit to gun buybacks. But if you ask the narrow cops and robbers question, are you getting good guns and is the homicide rate going down as a result, the answer is no.
Just to add to that, the research on communities and organizations is consistent with this. We know that if you bring people together in organization for collective tasks, even if it's something as perhaps mundane as fundraising, the research shows that there tend to be spillover effects, that people then get to know more people, talk about other problems. So the phenomenon of mobilization in these gun buyback programs, as Professor Skogan noted, it's important to really emphasize that these are potentially important, not just with respect to how many guns they bring in, but what are the knock-on effects and perhaps the additional consequences for the efficacy of the communities in dealing with problems more generally.
Thanks.
We have a question from Glenn Brooks. Glenn, I'm going to unmute
Hey,
your phone. Ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Glenn Brooks with Chicago Police Department CAPS, or formerly. I'm now leaving to actually head a national gun turn-in effort. But my question is, and by the way, hello, Wes. My question is on community mobilization and its effect on normalization in terms of community behavior. Do you feel that that community mobilization has any long-term effect on a community's acceptable behavior? Do you get it? Okay.
Wes, you got it?
Yes, I'm thinking.
Good.
Our questioner is a very experienced and effective community organizer, so I'm sure he has his own views of the correct answer here. And I would hate to contradict him because, as I said, he's effective and experienced. But I think the idea is that we need to find approaches to opening some safe space so that communities can recapture control of themselves. And part of the safe space that you're opening up can be filled by stronger norms, stronger families, stronger networks, better peers, being hooked into community-wide, city-wide institutions rather than being isolated in poor communities. And so that I think the answer is yes, and we've certainly seen historical projects over time that I think were pretty, like the Chicago Area Project, that were pretty effective in terms of building community solidarity and trust and helping communities become self-defending live entities. So I think that's right. I think there's an important role here. The question is how you open the safe space for the communities to recapture control of themselves. And I've talked about beat meetings and community policing is one strategy for that. But there's also autonomous action by effective community organizations and large and powerful churches that command the respect of a significant chunk of the local community. And they can also help create those kind of safe spaces as well.
I wanted to ask Professor Sampson myself, actually, in your view, and just as you've looked historically and you've cited works going way back, do you think Chicago is more or less a city of neighborhoods, as we might sort of popularly mythologize it now, than it used to be, or do you think it ever was, or how do you view that over the historical evolution?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Chicago is often thought of as a city of neighborhoods, but you know, when you start looking at other cities around the United States, you start to hear the same thing. I was just recently reading about Baltimore, called city of neighborhoods, and then even in areas of the Southwest where we typically think of more sprawling cities, Los Angeles has distinct neighborhoods. So I think when it comes to the phenomenon of people sorting and making decisions in real estate and schools and status, social differentiation, that place continues to be really important. And I'll give you one statistic that income segregation, or the sorting of people by income leading to communities that are increasingly segregated by income, is a phenomenon that's really taken off in the last 10 or 20 years. Racial segregation is modestly declining, but income segregation is increasing. Those are broad trends. In Chicago, I think if you look at the historical trends, I think you've seen shifts, not necessarily so much a change in the importance of neighborhoods. And what I mean by that is specific community area boundaries which were drawn back in the 20s and 30s. The names of those communities, the demographic groups have changed. So, for example, you know, with Little Village and Hilson were commonly named. That's not what they were originally called, but nonetheless, the broad sort of housing structures and economic status of the communities are relatively stable. So I think what we've seen is some differentiation, particularly within certain community areas and sort of carving out of some neighborhoods. So there's been shift, there's been evolution over time, but at a broad level, as I argued at the very beginning, this sort of pecking order and status differentials and how that relates to resource allocations tends to be a very persistent phenomenon.
Interesting.
We have another question from the audience. We've not heard any mention of issues related to mental health. What are your thoughts about how issues of mental health contribute to gun violence?
Well, I am not an expert on the link between mental health and gun violence. I would say, though, that it's an important question to ask, and I think from the research that I do, I think the relationship between the provision of mental health services and particularly addiction and drug abuse, alcohol abuse problems as well, this sort of constellation of social service factors are increasingly important, especially with reduction in the provision of services in many areas with the changes in the healthcare law. And also, we need to keep in mind an important fact, and that is that the incarceration rate, we talk a lot about mass incarceration and the boom, but the fact is that it's now coming down. And more people are being released into the communities, which is providing a real challenge to vulnerable and disproportionately poor communities, because offenders coming out of prison are, for the most part, going back either to the same community from which they were admitted to prison or to communities like them in terms of the severe concentration of disadvantage. And they have quite significant overall challenges with respect to mental health, with regard to addiction. So I think this is a spot-on question. In terms of the causal link between mental health and violence, I don't have an answer on that.
I think just in general, jails and prisons have become our principal mental health care system in this country. I mean, the Bureau of Justice Statistics did a study in their survey of inmates where they had a kind of a brief checklist inventory and showed that the level of measurable level of mental health problems was very substantial. I forget the percentages, but very high in American prisons. I know that among youth in the Cook County Jail, which is a little closer to home, that when you use a more complicated inventory of mental health symptoms, that 40%, that's 40% of the youth in Cook County Jail show substantial to high levels of mental health issues. And a bigger percentage than that in interview studies report serious head traumas in their youth. And head trauma is a huge predictor of future mental health problems. So that the confluence between being incarcerated and having mental health problems is very, very high.
We have a question from Reverend Tolliver. Reverend Tolliver, I'm going to unmute your phone.
Reverend Tolliver.
Okay, I think we've lost Reverend Tolliver. We do have another question. Question from the audience. Do you feel that improved acclimation of incarcerated offenders would lead to lower criminal activity?
I take that to mean, yeah, sort of reintegration of offenders back into the community. I think is important area of research. It's something, as I noted just a minute ago, that is becoming increasingly of concern to communities, to criminal justice systems across the country as we see an increasing flow back into the community. And I think that what we know is that incarceration cuts people off by definition from society. We know that in terms of employment, in terms of trying to get a foothold back into civil society, it's a very, very tough leap. And given the numbers that we can expect to see coming back into the communities programs that reintegrate offenders, get them reacclimated to social life in the community is essential, and that includes the mental health services as were noted. But importantly, the employment issue, I think, is central here. And there used to be, I think, more of a sense in which the criminal justice system and probation and parole officers were keyed into helping offenders get reintegrated with respect to employment. With cutbacks and budget scenarios as they've been, I think that has fallen somewhat by the wayside, and that's, I think, problematic from a policy perspective. I think the ability to maintain those services and focus more directly back on the employment link will be crucial to the reintegration effort.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I think it's right. There's two great groups, and when I say great, it's because they're numerous. There's two great groups for whom the society has taken responsibility and control, and one is parolees, people who have just been released from prison, and the other is probationers. And don't forget that the probation is much more important than jail or prison in terms of the number of people who are in its clutches. So that programs, affirmative programs for and including probationers and parolees have a really high, potentially a really high leverage point on crime, because these are folks who are already gotten in trouble, whom the prediction that they're going to get in trouble again is pretty high, but we know them and we know their names and we know where they live, and finding ways of involving them in these kinds of programs may be the single best leverage point we've actually got in terms of responding to crime.
Okay, we have time for one final question before we wrap up. Kathy?
Is there a correlation through years between gun legislation and gun violence rates?
It's pretty weak, and one problem, of course, is that gun legislation is either municipal, county, or state, or federal, and the federal has been in retreat and has not been very strong, the interstate movement of guns is very substantial, and the movement around the state across county lines is very substantial. It's one of these areas where the absence of federal regulation, the absence of a strong federal law, means that the varying availability of guns in various places, how much guns are going to cost in various places, the regulations about storing and moving in various places means that areas of the country that don't have legal access to guns still have access to guns, because there's plenty of areas in the country that are happy, willing, and able to sell them the guns. So we have a national gun market, and we have sporadic local attempts to engage in regulation of a large, booming national market, and it simply can't succeed.
Well, that wraps up the time that we have with our audience for questions. I want to personally send out very, very special thanks to Professors Wesley Skogan and Robert Sampson, without whose participation this wouldn't have been what it is. So thanks certainly from me, and I want to wind it up, turn it back over to Terry Mazzani, our President and CEO here at the Chicago Community Trust.
Thank you, Jim Lewis, for organizing a very rich and insightful Impact Chicago webinar focused on the challenge of violence in our communities. I hope that the audience has found it useful to have access to important information, and to our two experts, Professor Sampson and Skogen, who have, I think, illuminated a number of different facets of the issue. It's always helpful to have a longer-term context for the violence that we're facing, and to understand, as one of the presenters said, that a single data point does not make a trend, and that the 2013 aberration may be just that, in fact, and we may be trending down again. In any case, it's important to note that our homicide rates are far higher than many other cities and communities when you look at it in proportion to our population, and that we continue to be engaged with elected officials, civic leaders, businesses, community organizations, and residents to find ways to support effective strategies that alleviate violence in our communities, lead to more healthy living conditions, reopen the opportunities for children to safely attend schools of their choice, for residents to enjoy the resources of parks and shopping in their neighborhood, and for our residents to feel comfortable and free going about their business or going to and from work so that they can participate in our economy and contribute, and to put on a very positive face for the city of Chicago that continues to fuel the growth of tourism in our region as a very important part of our economy. All of these things do come together and focus on how we are perceived nationally and internationally as either a very safe city or as a violent city for that. So we got a lot of information here. I want to formally thank Jim Lewis for organizing this, Professors Sampson and Skogen for sharing their research and expertise. These materials are available on our web. And then behind the scenes in the production studio, we've got Kathy Pope and Brandon Thorne, who have done all that it takes, along with our IT staff here at the Chicago Community Trust, to make available a new format, make it convenient for people to access knowledge and information that is aggregated here at the Trust as we go about our working in support of organizations that are making a difference in our community every day. With that, we will close our webinar. Thank you all for participating.